St. Stephen family, we are so excited to bring you this groundbreaking story that is truly buzzing around our city. Reporting from Mandy McLaren, who is the education reporter for the Courier Journal, takes a deep look into the history of busing and segregation in Jefferson County Public School system and tackles the term bad school. Welcome, Mandy. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. And we're still in the work from home situation, so I'm close to the airport, so I do apologize if you hear planes or cars passing by out front.
Listen, the conversation is going to be so engaging, they will not even think about the sounds they may hear. Well, thank you, Mandy, again, for joining us. And real quick, talk about your series, Bad School, what it entails, and then we'll get right to the conversation.
Sure. So there's a lot of content. It's kind of a little bit confusing. So this is helpful to talk through it. So on the Courier Journal website, you have the digital project, which we've called Magnetic Pull. And you can go to courierjournal.com/magnetic pull, and you'll get to a landing page with all 6 of the stories that I reported for the project. The project really delves into something that isn't going to be too shocking, to be honest, to a lot of people in this community, about how magnet schools have been sort of perpetuating some of the inequities in the school system, even though magnets, their original intent was to foster diversity and create equal education for students, no matter what background they came from. In addition to that, we've decided to produce a podcast that accompanies the project, and that's called A Bad School, bad in air quotes. And that is a 6-episode series that you can find like on Apple Podcasts. And that is, the title kind of says it, right? It's kind of busting this sort of saying that you hear a lot of, like, oh, that's a bad school, like you don't really want to send your kids there, and sort of examining what do we mean when we say that, as well as what are the consequences of adults saying that over and over to each other, especially on the kids that are inside those buildings.
Wow. Mandy, and I know that you are a transplant to this city, and I loved how you integrated the culture of Louisville, or you explained it, how here in Louisville, it's not about where you went to grade school or middle school or even college. It's about where you went to high school. And so this subject of, digging in and talking about the bad school and bringing up the history of busing and integration in JCPS, what prompted you to do this piece?
I will say that, I have a background that I think really drew me to moving to Louisville. Both of my parents were public school teachers. I grew up in a very different environment than the city of Louisville. I'm from a very small town in Massachusetts that's rural, nearly entirely white, or at least it was back when I was going to school in the 90s and in the early 2000s. And I swore to myself I was never going to be a teacher.
Wow.
Because I had seen, particularly on my mother, who was a single mom raising my sister and I, just how much work it takes to be a teacher these days.
Yeah.
And that was even 20 years ago now. So imagine how greater the challenges have become for families these days. But, life doesn't turn out always the way you expect it. So after college, what did I do? I ended up being a teacher, and I taught in New Orleans public schools for 7 years. And, my heart is really in what you would call bad schools, because that's where I spent my time. And, I was a bad school teacher. My kids were the bad school students. And so when I had the opportunity after going to grad school to come here and cover education for the Courier Journal, I was really drawn to everything that I had heard about Jefferson County Public Schools and, its historical efforts to, use busing, use magnets to integrate its schools. And then when I got here for my interview and started talking to folks who had been living here all their lives, and you start to hear, oh, what? Are you sure? Like some things that as an outsider, it just didn't jive with this sort of, pristine national reputation that this district has in a lot of education circles.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, this has been a project, I think, in the making since I moved here it'll be about exactly 4 years ago. So.
Wow. Talk about skeletons in the closet. In your piece, you used a term, school on fire, and you are really tackling and delving into a tale of two cities, a tale of two schools, Iroquois High School and the acclaimed DuPont Manuel High School. Talk to the viewers about that and what made you choose these two schools in particular?
Yeah, so, the easiest answer is if you just look at the most recent state accountability rankings that we had pre-pandemic, the number one top ranked school in the state was DuPont Manual, which is probably no surprise. And at the very bottom of every single high school in the state was Iroquois High School.
Yeah.
And so how is that possible that in the same community, a district that's run by the same superintendent, governed by the same school board, we're using the same pot of taxpayer money. How is that possible that this is happening? And how is it possible that this has now been happening for decades?
Yeah.
That Iroquois, Western, Shawnee, you name it, that handful of schools, they are just constantly down here. Well, a school like Manual is constantly at the top. And so clearly, like that's the issue right there. And so, I will say I was very fortunate that the district played ball with me, right? Because a lot of the nuance that you hear in the podcast, when I take you inside Iroquois and I take you inside Manual with these incredible students, that was only possible because the district gave me the space and time to be there.
Yeah.
And you would hope as a public school district, they do that anyways. But, nowadays that is becoming a rarity to give reporters that level of access. So yeah, I really hope when you listen to the podcast, you can feel like you're there much more than you can reading a story in the newspaper.
Right. And Mandy, I would actually attribute a lot of that to who is over their communications now, Renee Murphy, who was a journalist herself for several years. And when you talked about how you were surprised that you were able to gain access, I'm like, I think Renee had a lot to do with that. And then Dr. Marty Polio, he's there to, make changes. And so it's kind of like being an open book.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just my opinion. An interesting component that you integrated in the piece, and something that our community could be very proud and excited that you actually mentioned this part, which a lot of people don't mention when they talk about, children, violence in the school system and children acting out. And they don't ever talk about things that definitely affect children's behavior, like poverty, hunger, and violence, which are things that a lot of students that go to Iroquois High School deal with. Talk about that.
Yeah, well, so in the podcast, there's one student in particular that I follow, and his name is Zyron Hibbett. He was a junior at Iroquois last year. And again, I think I was just very fortunate that he was willing to be so open and transparent with me, because that's just who he was, right? I would go be around him in classes, and he would turn and have these conversations with a classmate about how, violence in the community was affecting he and his classmates there. So I got to sort of soak that up peripherally in addition to talking to him about it. And so, it ranges from these things. I think the one thing that really struck me is, I think we're well aware, at least I am from, living in New Orleans, about T-shirts, right? In memoriam T-shirts after you've lost a friend or a loved one. And clearly that's something that in these bad schools you see. But the one that like detail that resonated with me was on your lock screen on your phone, right? There are kids in these school buildings that their lock screen on their phone is a picture of a classmate who was shot and killed. And that's how close, like this is in your hand all day, every
Yeah.
day. That's how close that this issue is impacting them. And that does affect their, ability to learn. It shows up different way in different kids, right? For one kid, it just might turn into total apathy. Maybe they just don't even show up to school anymore. For another kid, it could turn into defiance. I'm here, but I'm not going to do anything you want me to do because, like, what is the point? What is the point when this is how the world treats me and my community?
When you were talking with Zyron, and interesting fact that he was on track to actually attend DuPont Manual High School, and him getting into trouble. And in some ways, people would feel like it totally affected the trajectory of his life. Talk about that.
Yeah, and so this is where we get into that uneven playing field that a school like Manual versus a school like Iroquois, like they're not even playing on the same field, right? And so whereas Iroquois, any child that lives within their enrollment boundaries, they have to accept, regardless of, if they got into, issues in the community or whatever it may be. Whereas a school like Manual, they have that privilege to decide who they allow in. And even when you're allowed in magnet schools, and it's not just Manual, it's Butler, it's Barrett Traditional, it's all these schools, these magnet schools. They also have this power to exit students. They can basically kick kids out. And again, like a school like Iroquois can't do that. And I think Zyron was just such a visceral example of a child. He was a child. He was 14 years old.
Yeah.
Thinking that he was going to go with a lot of his friends from the East End to Manual and have this life that everybody around him, it was just expected. And he had gotten his way in on that trajectory to only, sort of see it taken away from him. To me, it's just like, and it's, the thing is, it's not just him. That's happening every year to 14-year-olds when they find out where they're assigned for high school and they just feel completely doomed, which I just think is really tragic.
Wow. Could you expound for us briefly the history of busing and JCPS? And I was also shocked to learn again, as we were talking off air, that I, grew up and went to school across the bridge in Southern Indiana, as to where busing isn't a thing. But I was shocked to hear about how white parents in the suburbs banded together and dissolved busing in the suburbs, but it continued for those that lived in West Louisville. How do you think this could have played out differently had that decision not been made to dissolve busing in the suburbs?
Yeah, I think that's the $1 million question, right? The what if?
Yeah.
What if we had stayed the course with this? Would our neighborhoods look different now, right? If you still had suburban children being bused into, the West End or other predominantly Black areas of the city at the rates that they were back during the early years of busing, would that have led to more of those children growing up and being adults and saying like, hey, I want to live in this community? Would we see more integrated communities now? Then, because when you get to the integrated community, that's the goal, right? Because then you don't need to do this crazy crisscrossing around the county busing when you have folks from different backgrounds and races living in an area together. But that's not what happened. And, it's not just in Louisville, it's across the country where these integration plans in the 70s were very strong. The federal courts were very stringent in their the rules that these districts had to follow. And you know what? In 1984, the district made a decision to roll a lot of that back. But I will say, even if they hadn't done that, in the early 90s, when you start to see more Reagan appointees in the federal court system, you see a lot of these desegregation orders dissolved, even though desegregation hadn't actually been achieved.
Wow. So after all of your, well, real quick, I wanted to know is what has been the most mind-blowing thing you've uncovered while working on this piece?
Oh gosh. I mean, I guess the one thing that I did not know going into this was that Iroquois used to be the school that everybody wanted their kids to go to.
Yes, that was start like when you begin to uncover it, I was like, what? So tell our viewers about that. That was very interesting to learn.
Yeah. So after, we had integration in Louisville and the surrounding suburbs actually began in 1956, but it was very slow. And once, even though it was slow, parents began to be dissatisfied. That's where you started to hear the term neighborhood schools. And this is before busing even started. And so at that time, the area around Churchill Downs in the South End was full of post-World War II families that had been sending their children into the city to go to Manuel. Manuel, before 1956, was an all-white school. After 1956, as it starts to integrate, then the South End community starts to pressure the school board and say, we want a school closer to our home, right? We no longer want to send our children all the way to Manuel, even though just a few years ago, we didn't, the bus ride, we weren't that worried about it. And so what ended up happening is the school board acquiesced, and despite all warnings that this school was going to become, a bastion for white segregation, they approved it. The school was opened as a high school, and for at least a decade, Iroquois was, one of the top schools in the district. Iroquois and Atherton, actually, which had the same experience. That school opened under the same pressures, parents wanting a school closer to where they were. And it wasn't until in the 70s, busing started, that you actually started to see Iroquois integrate and have more and more Black students. And then from there, of course, then another change comes, right? Yeah. The parents show up again, and that's when you see Manuel turned into a magnet. Yeah. Male, Butler, all of these schools that would become sort of these enclaves, might be a strong word, but places where parents could go, stay in the public system. They don't have to pay for it, but they could go there to, escape what Iroquois had become.
Wow. Mandy, I could sit here and talk to you all day, because this has been such an interesting and insightful piece. So just two questions, and then we're going to let you get back to your day. Something that you discussed, and something a lot of people had an opportunity to kind of see, but not really go in depth about how the pandemic affected school systems differently, or populations differently. And those that are from the predominantly Black schools and areas were affected more gravely than those that were not. You talked in the piece about how when the student from Iroquois went back, a lot of his classmates did not return, and he talked about the struggle. Talk about the differences in the school systems, in the schools, following the pandemic.
Yeah, and this is, again, it shouldn't be surprising to any of us, right? We know that at these high poverty schools, these are kids who oftentimes, if it's a situation where you're not at school and your siblings aren't at school and mom is working all day, you can't be tuned into your online schooling because you've got to make sure your younger siblings are doing their work,
Yeah.
or just internet connectivity, just like a myriad of things. You picking up your own job during the daytime to help support your family during the pandemic as folks were dealing with a lot of family members being sick, and all of a sudden that income is gone. So you saw it very much concentrated, the effect at these schools. But I will say one thing that was, just really tough to listen to. All 3 students that are featured in the podcast, to hear them talk about their mental health during the pandemic, it's just really tough to hear. And, there's not space in the podcast to get entirely into it, but, the teens in this community, they understand the inequities, right?
Yeah.
They know what's happening, and they want to see change. They want to see the adults do more, but at the same time, they're still kids, right? And like being disconnected from your peer group for that long really takes a toll on you, really, no matter your background.
Wow. So this is definitely the podcast. And again, if you're just now joining us, we are joined by Miss Mandy McLaren, who is the education reporter for the Courier Journal. And we're talking about her phenomenal piece, Bad School. What is it that you hope to achieve with this project? What is it that you hope to see changed in the JCPS school system with this piece?
Yeah. As a reporter, you're not supposed to have like, this is the thing that I'm trying to get people to achieve, right? My job is just to report the facts. So there are, several potential solutions that could start to chip away at these inequities. And a lot of them are going to take a lot of, I think, political courage from the district and the school board.
Mm-hmm.
Because we've seen this before. These similar proposals come up and they move forward, but then they quietly disappear.
Yeah.
Under pressure from parents. I think for me, I'll be honest, I do have a motive with this project. And it's simply this, is for the community to stop, reflect, and think about how we talk about schools.
Yeah.
But that's all I really can ask for, from my position as a journalist. Think about how the way we describe schools and talk about schools, how that action, and you might think it's just you, but collectively, when it's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of adults, just contributing to that dialogue, the impact that has, especially on the kids inside those buildings.
Right. Referring to Iroquois as the dirty eye, or using the term bad school, good school. Mandy, again, thank you so much for your time and educating and enlightening our viewers with your special report and this information. Tell them again how they can read and listen to this phenomenal report.
Sure. For anybody that likes to read, I have a lot of stories for you to work your way through. And again, you can find that series at courierjournal.com/magnetic pull. For those of you that are interested in the podcast that Krystal and I have been talking about, the easiest way for me is just open up your Apple Podcast app on your smartphone. It's a little purple app, and search for A Bad School. And it should come up, and just hit the follow button and listen along with us. We have 2 episodes left to come out, so you can still get caught up.
Mandy, thank you so much for all that you do. And we're just excited and curious to see what else will come from this report. Thank you. Life-changing reporting, life-changing journalism at its finest. Miss Mandy McLaren, education reporter for the Courier Journal. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.